Dear learners, in the last part we discussed why democracy and justice are central issues for understanding climate change. In this part, we will look at very briefly the history of global climate change negotiations. In 1988, under the aegis of the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Programme, the IPCC was formed. The IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You must realize that the question of global warming or the question of climate change has not been discussed for a greater part of the 20th century. It was only in the 1980s that at a global level, in a systematic way, people began to talk about climate change. So towards the late 80s, or in 1988, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was formed. The IPCC is a body which reviews the work of thousands of scientists across the world on climate change. The IPCC consists of three working groups. Working Group 1, which works on the physical science basis of climate change as a phenomenon. This working group distills the work of natural scientists across the world on a number of issues. For instance, what is the extent to which climate change has happened? How much climate change can we expect in the future? Third, is climate change caused by human activities? Fourth, what are the different kinds of activities and to what extent have these activities contributed to global climate change? The second working group looks at the impacts of climate change and adaptation. What does adaptation mean? Adaptation basically refers to the fact that now that we have climate change, now that the climate is changing and it will change in the future, how do our socio-economic systems adjust or adapt to that climate change? Okay, so this second working group looks at the different impacts or implications of climate change and adaptation strategies. And the third working group of the IPCC looks at the question of mitigation. What is mitigation? Mitigation basically refers to efforts to reduce the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, those gases which are causing global warming or climate change. The first report of the IPCC came in the year 1990. And in this report, IPCC was fairly confident about two things. Firstly, that yes, our climate is indeed changing. Okay, and global temperature, global average annual temperatures have been rising from the beginning of the industrial period. And secondly, it is our activities like emission from the burning of fossil fuels, emission of greenhouse gases, and second, land use changes like deforestation are contributing to this climate change. So it was fairly confident on these two questions. At around the same time, recognizing the urgency of the situation, the United Nations set up an intergovernmental negotiating committee having representatives from different countries. And an intense and heated debate started on the question of the kind of global policy that we need to address climate change. It was very clear to all countries, particularly now that there was the first report of the IPCC, it was clear to most people that at a global level, we have to cut down on emissions. But who bears this burden? That was the central question in these negotiations. And the basic division was between the developed countries and the developing countries. The developing countries made certain very specific and very powerful arguments. What were these arguments? Now, when I say developing countries, I mean developing countries as a whole, but countries like India and China played a remarkably prominent role in articulating these positions. What were these arguments? The first thing that the developing countries said was that, look, developed countries have contributed the lion's share to historical emissions till now, since the beginning of the industrial period. Therefore, it is these countries which have to take the lead in reducing emissions. It is these countries which must take up legally binding emission cuts. Secondly, they said that because these countries have already, the developed countries have already achieved certain basic developmental tasks, it is the developing countries which now have to do that. They have to resolve basic developmental questions like poverty, hunger, joblessness, etc. Therefore, as far as the developing countries are concerned, no legally binding emission cuts should be imposed on them. Basically, the developing countries were arguing for a differentiated structure where the responsibilities of the developed and developing countries were to be different. The third argument made by the developing countries was that, look, developed countries have amassed so many resources because of the kind of emissions that their industries have had, and therefore these resources must now be at least partly used to enable the developing countries to adapt to climate change. Okay, adaptation is an expensive exercise, and developing countries, being poor countries, cannot foot the bill completely on their own. Therefore, those countries which have the lion's share of the responsibility of climate change till now have also the responsibility of helping the developing countries, the poorer countries, financially with their adaptation efforts. And finally, the developing countries argued that this greater industrial trajectory of the developed countries has meant that their scientific and technical know-how is also greater. Therefore, there should be a transfer of technical know-how from the developed to the developing countries so that developing countries can address climate change in a better way. These developing countries, being poor countries, in terms of scientific and technical know-how, do not have adequate resources, and the developed countries must help them out. So these were the basic arguments being made by developing countries like India and China. And these arguments, these debates continued for 2 years. And finally, in the year 1992, in this conference called the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which took place in Rio and therefore was also called the Rio Summit, finally in that Rio Summit, a document called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was introduced. This convention was supposed to be the framework which would guide further global efforts in tackling climate change. And it must be remembered and emphasized that if you go through the UNFCCC, you will realize that the differentiated structure which the developing countries were arguing for were very substantially incorporated into the structure of the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC basically divides countries of the world into 3 groups. The first group is called the Annexure 1. Annexure 1 is basically the group of developed countries across the world, be they traditional capitalist countries like the United States, UK, France, Germany, etc., or be they former socialist countries like Russia. Annexure 2 was those countries which consisted of your traditional capitalist countries, US, Germany, etc. Annexure 2 did not include countries like Russia. And third and final group, called the non-Annex 1 countries, basically referred to the developing countries of the world, essentially the rest of the world. Now, these 3 groups of countries had different responsibilities within the UNFCCC. Annex 1 countries had the responsibility of taking on legally binding emission cuts. Okay? So countries from the United States to Germany to France to Russia had to take up legally binding emission reduction targets. Annexure 2 countries were the countries responsible for financing adaptation efforts of third world or developing countries, as also countries responsible for making technology transfers to developing countries. Now, why was this the responsibility of Annexure 2 countries? Because after the collapse of the communist bloc, countries like Russia and number of East European countries went through periods of severe recession or economic contraction. Therefore, these countries being responsible for financial flows to developing countries for adaptation was not thought to be a very viable thing, which is why Annexure 1 responsibilities were demarcated from Annexure 2 responsibilities. And as far as the non-Annex 1 countries were concerned, as far as the developing countries were concerned, it was understood that they would take measures and steps on their own to tackle the question of climate change. They would make mitigation as well as adaptation efforts, but they will not be required to take on legally binding emission cuts. Now, not only was the differentiated structure expressed in this grouping of countries, in a very important article of the UNFCCC, the third article, article number 3, this principle of differentiation is expressed in what is called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This article basically says that yes, climate change is a global problem. It is responsibility of all countries to address climate change, but these responsibilities will be differentiated, okay, on the basis both of contribution to historical climate change as also on the basis of the kind of capabilities different countries have in addressing climate change. So Article 3, which contains the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, has been a central feature of the UNFCCC paradigm. Now please remember that a convention itself does not have legally binding force. For it to have legal teeth, it needs a protocol. And this protocol comes in 1997. In the Conference of Parties, which happens every year, parties to the UNFCCC, begins in the year 1995. Okay, the first conference of parties takes place in Berlin, which results in the Berlin Mandate, which basically says that look, the principles laid down in the UNFCCC have to be given the shape of a protocol if it is to be legally binding. So very soon we will have to adopt a legally binding protocol. And this adoption takes place in the third conference of parties, which took place in Kyoto. And therefore this protocol gets the name of the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol basically lays down the essential shape of the architecture which governs, the policy architecture which governs climate change globally for a long time. What basically does the Kyoto Protocol say? The Kyoto Protocol says, firstly, that Annex 1 countries have to take up immediate emission reduction targets. What would be the baseline for these targets? The baseline would be the emission levels in the year 1990. What would be the target period? So these goals would have to, reduction goals would have to be achieved by the period between 2008 and 2012. This period was also called the commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. So by 2008 and 2012, by this period, developed countries have to reduce on an average their emissions to 5.2% below their 1990 emission levels. That was the first and the most important point. The second point is that in terms of finance and technology, the developed countries will help out the developing countries through both the flow of funds as also technology transfer. And the third point which the Kyoto Protocol laid down is that there would be some mechanisms by which the first world countries or the Annex 1 countries can both help out the developing countries as also add to their performance of emission reduction. One such mechanism was what was called the Clean Development Mechanism, which basically allowed developed countries to have greater or to put in place greater carbon dioxide sinks. So for instance, the United States could finance finance a project of afforestation in a country like India, and that financing would earn it some relaxation as far as its emission reduction targets were concerned. Okay, so these were some of the basic features of the Kyoto Protocol. But the Kyoto Protocol had an important condition for it to come into effect. What was that condition? It basically said that at least 55 developed countries, accounting for at least 55 of the total global annual emissions, have to be signatories of the Kyoto Protocol for the protocol to come into effect. Why was this condition put there? As I said earlier, you have to, for any treaty to be successful, the biggest emitters have to be brought on board, because if you do not have the biggest emitters, then that treaty would be bereft of any significant meaning. And this requirement turned out to be a very thorny and problematic issue for the Kyoto Protocol. Because remember, the year is 1997, it is the Bill Clinton administration in the United States. When the Kyoto Protocol comes, Clinton openly makes certain positive statements of intent about America joining the Kyoto Protocol. It participates in the Kyoto process. But by the time you come to 2000, when the Clinton administration goes and the George W. Bush administration comes, the Republican Party comes to power, and one of the first administrative acts of the George Bush government was to pull America out of the Kyoto process. What was the argument given by America? The argument was this, that look, if we undertake these emission cuts, and if emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, they are not subjected to compulsory emission cuts, then our goods in the global economic system will become less competitive. Therefore, the Kyoto Protocol goes against the sovereign and economic interests of the United States, and therefore we can't become a part of it. And this process goes on for a very long time, till towards the end of 2004, Russia signs on to the Kyoto Protocol, and finally the 55% condition is satisfied. And therefore, it is only in February 2005 that the Kyoto Protocol, a good 8 years after its initial adoption, after its introduction, comes into effect. But by the time you come to the year 2009, you come to the Conference of Parties, which was held in Copenhagen, you realize that the United States primarily, but also many other countries along with it, begin systematic attempts to move away from the Kyoto kind of differentiated structure. This is, of course, despite the fact that by the year 2007, you already have the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, which tells you very clearly that in terms of addressing climate change, there is very little emissions budget for the future which is left. There is very little time which is left. But despite this improved scientific knowledge, there is an attempt from a number of developed countries in the Copenhagen Conference to basically argue that the Kyoto kind of structure is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, it is a differentiated structure, and therefore it leaves out emerging economies like India, China, etc., which by now have also emerged, at least in absolute terms, as big emitters. And secondly, countries like the United States argue that Kyoto kind of top-down structures are completely undemocratic because they are top-down. So what you need is not a system of top-down emission reduction targets, but a system of pledge and review, wherein different countries can make different kinds of voluntary commitments, and their responsibility then will be to live up to those commitments. And it is essentially this kind of a pledge and review mechanism that we find is what defines the global emissions reduction architecture today. So if you look at the Paris Conference, the Conference of Parties in Paris in the year 2015, it is this kind of a pledge and review mechanism which forms its foundation. What does this pledge and review mechanism mean? It means that different countries give what are called intended nationally determined contributions. These are contributions which different countries have voluntarily committed to. And every few years, it will be assessed whether the countries have lived up to their respective INDCs or not. The next important event in terms of taking stock of the performance of different countries in living up to their INDCs is called the Global Stocktake, and it will take place in the year 2023. Now, a lot of people have made this criticism that the pledge and review mechanism and the abandonment of the Kyoto kind of structure has two basic problems. First, it leaves out the question of historic responsibility and equity. It completely leaves out of account the fact that a handful of developed countries have accounted for a lion's share of emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases till now. And secondly, it also leaves aside the fact that today we know in a very specific and certain way the kind of emission space that we have for the future. So in the words of one commentator, the system today is as if we are playing a limited overs cricket match and we know what the opponent has scored, but I say that regardless of what the target is, I will score however many runs I want. For a number of commentators, the global emissions architecture today, because it is voluntary, because it does not specify certain emission reduction targets for certain countries, because it does not because it does not specify emission reduction targets for specific countries, amounts to this kind of a disregard of what the target is. It amounts to this kind of a disregard for what the science tells us. To sum up, the basic dynamic which has governed the trajectory of global climate change negotiations has been the difference between the developed countries, particularly developed countries like the United States of America, and developing countries. Okay, we find that despite that, for a long period, the UNFCCC as also the Kyoto Protocol ensured that questions of equity and historical responsibility lies at the center of the global emissions architecture, of the global policy framework dealing with climate change. But since the Copenhagen Conference in 2009, and something which has been concretely expressed in the Paris Conference outcome, we find that there has been a shift from that emphasis on equity and differentiated responsibility to a voluntary system of pledge and review. And certain critics point out that in terms of meeting our climate goals, this kind of a shift does not augur well.